Fairies. The TLDR for this faction is their average butt, with a very big butt. They care an awful lot about their matchups, because this girl will just win you the game against apes. And they care an awful lot about draw luck, because this is a really, really powerful boss monster, and this is a really, really good 4. But their actions are not great. So they're very much dependent on drawing those 3 cards, Titania or one of their 2 copies of Glimmer, in order to have a good game. So overall, average but inconsistent. So I think Fairies are a faction that has enough text on their cards that it's worth going through most of the cards one by one. Starting with the minions. Most of the time, Fairies will win a game because of their minions. Titania is just incredibly powerful. The return an opponent's minion to its owner's hand is almost never relevant, and Titania might as well just read, play an extra minion. That attached to a 5-power body is just so powerful that it will generate bursts that win bases and go on to help you win the game. The ability to return an opponent's minion to its owner's hand would actually be very relevant if the Fairies needed help dealing with actions played on opposing minions or power counters in some way. And there are a few matchups against Giant Ants or Mad Scientists where you might consider playing a Titania in order to get rid of a huge stack of power counters, but in practice, that bounce ability ends up helping you in matchups which you're going to be winning anyway. Their next most powerful minion is Glimmer, and Glimmer is very, very useful strategically. You throw Glimmer somewhere and give -4 power to an opponent at some base that you want to help defend, and you wait until you're ready to break Glimmer's base. If Glimmer happens to be at the same base as the minion you're debuffing, then at the start of your turn when you're ready to break, you give your opponent +4 by removing the -4, and give Glimmer +1 on the same turn, and that's a 5-power boost without using your minion play or your action play, which means that your opponent has to stay a very long way from the base's breakpoint in order to prevent you from breaking the base on your turn. And that in turn means your opponent is going to need a lot of burst or just to get way, way ahead with removal in order to deal with a Glimmer. Another nice feature of Glimmer is even if your opponent kills the Glimmer, the -4 doesn't go away until the start of your turn anyway. Then I'm going to skip over a minion to Tinks before going to Puck, because alongside Glimmer there's another useful burst ability that you can use with Glimmer's burst, and that is the Tinks Daisy Chain combo. Even if you're not facing an opponent who plays beneficial actions on their own minions, Tinks is still pretty good because you play a Daisy Chain on an opponent's minion and it gives them -2. On your next turn, on the turn when you're ready to break a base, you play Tinks and transfer the Daisy Chain to your Tinks. The Tinks becomes a 4, and opponent's minion gains 2 power from what it was, and you've just increased the base's total power by 6 with your minion play and a 2-power minion alone. That's probably the one difficult to spot play that you need to know when playing Fairies. Most of the rest of the decisions are not terribly difficult. And of course, Tinks also serves as a hard counter to apes, an almost as hard counter to dwarves, and any other faction that wants to play beneficial actions on its own minions. Tinks restricts them horribly. If you're playing against Fairies with a faction like apes or dwarves, because Tinks is a 4 of, you have to play your play on a minion actions as burst cards, unless you think you have so many that you can run your opponent out of Tinks's, and spoiler alert, you don't. Because the Fairies player can choose to only take the actions that are really good, and leave the others on your minions, and just generally, they're going to torture you. So, Tinks I tend to think of as a little bit of a design mistake, because a 4 of is just such a hard counter against apes or dwarves that I think it makes the game a little bit worse because the Fairies faction exists. And with 2020 hindsight, I think Tinks' ability probably belonged on the 4-power minion, so that the Fairies would have to make a decision about, is this particular action worth stealing or not, and a weaker version of Glimmer's ability probably belonged on Tinks, but the Fairies faction is what it is, and they are just an absolute hard counter to the Apes. And finally we get to Puck. He's got the shortest text of any Fairies minion, and I think he's actually the hardest to play with, because a lot of the time this is going to be an interesting decision. Sometimes it's going to be very easy. If you play Fairy Dinosaurs, Puck is the card that make the Fairy Dinosaurs deck work as a deck. If you play Fairy Giant Ants, Puck is the card that makes Fairy Giant Ants work as a deck. Because these are both two partner factions that absolutely love having a double action and don't have any way to play two of their own actions in one turn naturally. And playing a Puck to get an extra action and either play, two augmentations in the same turn, or play a Gimme the Prize and a We Will Rock You in the same turn is an extremely powerful play, and will make those decks actually work. With most other decks, most of the time, you're going to draw a card off of Puck. This is mainly because the Fairies action set is very lackluster, and so in order to have big turns and make real progress in the game, you're going to need to draw the Fairies' partner faction's actions paired with the Fairies' minions. And that means you're going to need a little more card draw than most other decks, because you want to get specific minions and specific actions in order to make the Fairies deck powerful. And that in turn means that you need a lot of card draw to have consistency. So in most matchups, you're going to definitely prefer either the extra action or definitely prefer the card, but there's also going to be a lot of borderline hands where it's like, well, maybe I need more draw, but I could do something interesting with an extra action, and so maybe you want to hang on to the Tinks to preserve the case of the extra action. But most of the time, if you're not playing with, Dinosaurs, Innsmouth, Giant Ants, or something else that is obviously starved for extra actions, you're just going to draw a card. While the Fairies have a fantastic slate of minions, they unfortunately pair this with a really, really lackluster set of actions. And I'm going to start with what I consider the worst offender of all of them, and that is Leaf Armor. Play on a minion, ongoing this minion has +1 power, talent, transfer this action to another minion. Obviously, by design, it's supposed to sacrifice the size of its power burst in order to gain some flexibility by moving it around from one minion to another. But in practice, with most Fairies decks, this talent only matters when you've spread out minions on multiple bases. And a lot of the time it's difficult to get a setup where that is relevant, even if this was a +2 power action. But as a +1 power action, it just doesn't add enough to be worth the tempo of spending an action play to get it into play. The one real exception is if you're playing Ape Fairies, which is a reasonable deck to draft a lot of time, because if you pick the Fairies first, nobody will want to pick the Apes against you. And in this case, Leaf Armor can go from a +1 to a +2 if moved to a Furious George, or it can go from a +1 to a +3 if you move it to a minion with Juiced Up. And that can be enough to make Leaf Armor at least a little bit relevant and a lot more powerful. But outside of playing with Apes, it just doesn't do enough to matter. Then we have a couple other actions which can never be bad cards, but generally just don't do anything. Magic Acorns, each other player discards a card at random, is really not better than draw a card and play an extra action. So in practice, I just always draw the card and play the extra action, unless I'm in a very, very specialized situation where I know I have to get rid of a specific card from my opponent's hand or I lose the game. Fairy Ballet is an interesting choice, and if the Fairies didn't have Puck, this would be a very interesting card. In practice, I almost always end up playing it for 2 cards on a turn where I have an action to spare, or I can observe by looking at the cards in my hand, hey, I'm not going to have an action to spare for 3 or 4 turns, and I just immediately play it for draw a card and play an extra action. Both of those cards tend to be more or less nothing cards that are never bad to draw but never have a positive impact relative to drawing some other card. Now, they have a good and a bad anti-action action. Playful Tricks is good. Destroy up to 2 actions played on minions and or bases. The fairies don't have any other way to get rid of an action on a base, so Playful Tricks is a useful silver bullet for specific on-base actions. Magic Ward, on the other hand, is a lot less useful. Yes, it prevents your opponent from playing actions on that base or on minions here. The second half of that is largely useless because Tinks is such a powerful card that your opponents usually don't want to play actions on minions. But both parts also suffer from the same problem as every other protection card in the game of Smash Up, and that is, unless you're on the very last base of the game, your opponent sees the card preventing them from playing a specific one of their cards, and they go, oh, okay, I'll hold this nice card in my hand until the next base and play it then. And it turns out that card is still useful to your opponent. So as a result, Magic Ward has a very little impact on the game most of the time. I already talked about Daisy Chain. Daisy Chain is, in fact, a good card. It's a 2-of. It works really well with Jinx. Jinx is a Pokemon. An Enchantment, which is also quite a good card as the Fairies card go. Enchantment is meant to have a choice, but in practice, you should virtually always play it for +1 power. It's just very, very good for breaking bases where your opponents have minions. And finally, Ladybug. Ladybug is the card where I kind of wish it was a 2-of. It makes a minion indestructible, and you can move it from minion to minion with a talent. I would love if Ladybug was a 2-of because that would turn Shapeshifter Fairies into a very interesting deck. Ladybug also has a lot of synergy with plants, and it would also make Plant Fairies a very interesting deck. But the problem is, as a 1-of, you're just not likely enough to draw it to make a big impact on these two decks. So it's a nice card to remember that if you play it on a Sprout, you're going to get free minions every turn. If you play it on a Shapeshifter minion, maybe in the same turn. Actually, if you're playing Shapeshifter Fairies, there is a combo to be aware of. Play Puck to enable a double action, and make your first action Ladybug and your second action Transmogrify. And you manage to go from no Ladybug in play to getting off a Transmogrify without having to kill one of your own minions in one turn. After all, the problem, and you can of course do the same thing with Shell Game and Transmogrify. The problem with Shell Game as a card is, while it has obvious synergy with Transmogrify, the Shapeshifters don't have any way to play 2 actions in the same turn, and so you end up telegraphing, hey look, I'm going to Transmogrify next turn, and you give your opponent or opponents a turn to do something about it. So Ladybug does actually have a nice trick associated with it. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about specific Fairies decks and specific matchups. When it comes to their opponent's deck, Fairies have 3 main matchups. They're going to win much more often than their rating would suggest against Apes and Dwarves because Tinks beats actions played on minions. Conversely, they're going to do worse than their rating would indicate if they're facing Sharks because Sharks are relatively good at killing Glimmer. They have at least 2 cards capable of killing a 4-power minion, and a 3rd card capable of bringing Glimmer down to 2 power to let their other cards kill it. And other than that, most of their other matchups against opposing decks are going to be pretty close to what you would expect. Now, when it comes to the Fairies' partners, there's some good and some bad partners for them. Starting with some of the bad partners I've noticed, at least among decks I've played. Fairy Princesses don't work very well, mostly because the Fairies tend to be strong on the minion side and having relatively weak actions, and so pairing them with a faction that has a bunch of 5-power minions doesn't make a lot of sense. You're going to end up with very strong minion plays coming from both factions, and the action plays are going to be relatively lackluster. Yes, the princesses have some very nice move actions, but this tends to have the same problem as another Fairies deck that didn't do so well in my games, and that's Fairy Tornadoes. I think the problem with Fairy Tornadoes is that both factions tend to have in-play control cards, cards that sit in play and control other cards that are already in play, and these tend to be bigger cards than their from-hand cards that control cards in play. And because of this, you end up with a deck that ends up surprisingly predictable for a deck that has so many options. Alien Fairies also had the same minion problem as Fairy Princesses had. Aliens tend to be very hungry for minion play so that they can play Invader, return it to their hand, play Invader again, and the fairies want to use their minion plays on fairy minions, which are generally very strong. So while the fairies tend to leave the action plays open for the aliens to play Broken Aliens actions, the aliens still don't really appreciate fairies' greediness for minion plays. On top of that, the aliens already do a pretty good job of controlling cards that are already in play, and they don't really need that from the fairies. Elder Fairies, same problem. You've got two strong slates of minions, and also the fairies just don't do enough to help get to 6 power to get Shoggoth in play. Fairy Explorers and Ghost Fairies also did worse than their ratings would have suggested, but there aren't as obvious reasons. Now, as far as some of the decks that have done better than expected, Ant Fairies did a little bit better than expected in 1v1, mainly because of Puck providing double actions and the Ants loving double actions. On top of Puck providing double actions, the Fairies also provide some control, which is really, really helpful for the Ants, because the Ants need to get through... The Ants need a certain number of tempi to... plural of tempos, to play their minions, put extra power counters on their minions, and then finally double all those power counters with We Will Rock You, and Glimmer really helps get you to that point. For that matter, Titania can get you 1 extra minion in play, and if that second minion is a Puck, you can go Titania into Puck using a double action, and go from having 1 minion in play to 3 minions in play, with the extra action to play both Gimme the Prize and We Will Rock You in the same turn. So the fairies are capable of enabling some really big giant ants plays. What else did well? Werewolf Fairies did well, but I'm not sure exactly how well, because most of the games I played with it, I played before I was recording everything onto the computer, and so I just have their win-loss records and their rating. I don't have what was expected of them. But why is Werewolf Fairies good? Werewolf Fairies just happen to work well together, partially because fairies debuff monsters, allowing werewolves to kill them more easily, but also the two factions just feel good together. And the last faction that did better than expected with the fairies were kitties in 1v1, because of course the debuffs provided by the fairies help shrink enemy monsters to the point where the kitties can steal them. And more opportunities to enable the kitties kit is always a good thing in 1v1. This was less so the case in multiplayer because you're doing a lot less in multiplayer of winning games with the kitties' abilities, and a lot more of the kitties saying, we would love to use our abilities, but we don't have the right target here, so partner faction, please win the game for me.